Senator Kennedy, you sit there dressed like the resume of a country club, and you still think you get to lecture working families about what they deserve. The room froze for half a second, and then the gallery reacted the way crowds always do when a line hits harder than policy, because even serious politics still runs on shock. If you're asking why Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez would go that far, or why John Kennedy would let her say it without interrupting, keep watching to the very end, because the reason isn't a soundbite, it's a setup. I'm going to be honest about my view right now, because pretending neutrality is the same as insight is how audiences get manipulated. Both of them are smart, both of them are calculating, and both of them are betting they can control the story. And in Washington, the person who controls the story doesn't always win the argument, but they almost always win the next election. This wasn't a street rally, and it wasn't a cable news cage match either, at least not officially, because the setting was polished, the cameras were steady, and everyone pretended the temperature was normal. The hearing had been advertised as an infrastructure discussion, the kind of thing that usually makes the public yawn. Except the public never yawned when AOC showed up, and Kennedy knew that. AOC arrived with the energy of someone who believes politics should feel like an emergency room, because in her worldview, complacency is the real violence, and discomfort is a necessary tool. Kennedy sat with the patience of someone who believes politics should feel like a courtroom, because in his worldview, emotion is persuasive, but evidence is sovereign, and the record is forever. And when those two instincts collide, the sparks aren't accidental, because both sides think they're protecting the country from a different kind of danger. AOC's first move wasn't a policy question, and that was intentional, because she didn't want to debate asphalt and procurement rules, she wanted to debate identity and legitimacy. She framed Kennedy as a symbol of institutional rot, the kind of senator who speaks warmly while voting coldly, and she implied his civility was a costume designed to keep the public calm. Kennedy didn't bite, and that also was intentional, because older political operators know that the audience expects the angry man to shout, so the calm man wins points by staying calm. He watched her the way a chess player watches a fast opponent who likes flashy moves, taking mental notes, letting her spend her energy, letting the cameras capture her heat. And that's the first trap in modern politics. If you speak with righteous speed, you may feel powerful, but you also give your opponent a clean rhythm to interrupt. AOC leaned forward and said that infrastructure is not only bridges and tunnels, it is dignity. And dignity collapses when working people can't afford insulin, rent, or tuition. She accused Kennedy of acting like fiscal restraint is morality while ignoring the moral cost of poverty. And she did it with that sharp cadence that turns a committee room into a stage. She pointed out that Louisiana struggles on health outcomes, wages, and disaster vulnerability. And she argued that a senator from that state should be leading with urgency, not lecturing about spending. Then she delivered the line she knew would circulate in clips, the one about the suit and the lecture, because she wanted the audience to feel the contrast, not just understand it. She wasn't only attacking Kennedy, she was trying to tattoo a narrative onto him. Privileged, performative, insulated, and therefore unqualified to judge her politics. Kennedy let the applause rise and fall, and that matters, because letting applause happen is a form of control, and control is what debates are really about. He thanked her for coming in the softest possible tone, which made her look hotter by comparison, and he praised her passion, which forced the audience to notice his restraint. Then he said something that sounded like a story, but functioned like a warning, because he told her he respects fire, but he doesn't respect fire that doesn't know what it burns. He reminded the room that infrastructure funding is not a slogan. It is a chain of decisions, And every broken link becomes a collapsed project that working people pay for twice. And right there, without insulting her, he repositioned the fight. Not young versus old, not left versus right, but performance versus competence, which is the most dangerous frame for anyone who lives on moral momentum. AOC noticed the shift, and she tried to pull it back to moral terrain by saying competence without compassion becomes technocracy that protects the powerful. Kennedy responded that compassion without competence becomes chaos that also protects the powerful, because chaos is where connected insiders thrive, while ordinary families drown in paperwork and delays. That line made a few people laugh, not because suffering is funny, but because everyone has felt the humiliation of bureaucracy, and humor is how a politician borrows shared frustration. AOC fired back that bureaucracy is often a deliberate design, because complexity is how institutions hide favoritism in plain sight. Kennedy agreed again, and that agreement was strategic, because agreement disarms audiences, and disarmed audiences are easier to guide toward your next point. Then Kennedy asked her a question that sounded respectful, but carried the weight of a cross-examination. Do you want to talk about what you believe, or do you want to talk about what you've actually built? AOC said she has built a movement that forced the country to confront inequality, and she framed her influence as proof that she's doing what traditional politicians never did. Kennedy said influence is real, but it is not the same thing as governance, because influence can be rented by algorithms, while governance requires patience that algorithms punish. AOC smiled in that tight way people smile when they recognize a critique that could stick, and she accused him of hiding behind process, because process is a shield for entrenched interests. Kennedy replied that process is either a shield or a spine depending on who's holding it. And he promised the room he wasn't here to protect entrenched interests. He was here to protect the public from cheap certainty. Now, I'll tell you what I think is happening, because viewers deserve context that doesn't flatter either side. AOC came in expecting Kennedy to react like a cartoon villain, because that's how her style wins, by turning the opponent into a symbol and then defeating the symbol publicly. Kennedy came in expecting her to perform, because he's been in politics long enough to know that the loudest moral language often appears when someone wants to shift attention away from difficult questions. Neither of them is stupid, and neither of them is accidentally in the spotlight, which is why the opening exchange felt personal but was actually strategic. And if you think this is only about infrastructure, you're about to see how fast it becomes a battle over credibility. Because credibility is the currency that buys you permission to ask the public for sacrifice. AOC tried to lock in her narrative by calling out theater, saying that Kennedy's charm is a performance designed to make harsh policies sound humane. Kennedy didn't deny the charm, and instead, he made a small joke about his accent, saying if he could really act that well, he'd be in Hollywood and not listening to federal procurement briefings. The room laughed, and AOC rolled her eyes, because jokes like that are not random. They soften the crowd and reposition the joker as relatable. AOC then asked him directly whether he believes a working mother should have to work 2 jobs and still be 1 accident away from ruin. And she demanded a simple yes or no. Kennedy said yes or no answers make great clips and terrible policy. And he told her he would not insult the public by pretending complex realities fit into a viral box. That's when the audience started asking, out loud and online, why Kennedy wasn't hitting back harder, and why AOC was swinging so aggressively at the start. And if you're asking that too, the answer is the same. Because both of them understand that the first 10 minutes decide who the audience thinks is honest. AOC wanted to define Kennedy as privileged before he could define her as performative, because once a label sticks, every later sentence gets filtered through it. Kennedy wanted to let her swing first, so the audience would see her aggression as a choice rather than a response, because the aggressor owns the temperature of the room. And in politics, whoever owns the temperature usually controls what the public remembers, even if they forget every single policy statistic. Kennedy finally leaned forward and said gently that if she wants to talk about working families, then the conversation should include the hardest question in government. He said the hardest question isn't who deserves help, because almost everyone does, and it isn't whether the system is unfair, because it obviously is, but whether the leaders asking for trust are willing to be accountable on details. AOC responded that she is accountable to people, not to spreadsheets, and that line played well with her base because it turns technocratic criticism into moral emptiness. Kennedy answered that people live inside spreadsheets whether they like it or not, because rent, interest, wages, and budgets are math dressed as life. And right there, with the calmness of someone opening a folder he's been waiting to open, he signaled what the rest of this confrontation would become. Not a shouting match, but a methodical test of whether AOC's moral story can survive contact with precision. Kennedy paused just long enough to let the room feel the shift, because silence is what turns a hearing into a reckoning when cameras are hungry. He said he wasn't interested in humiliating anyone, but he was very interested in whether the public was being sold a feeling instead of a plan, because feelings don't pour concrete. AOC tried to reclaim the momentum by saying that plans without moral clarity are how corruption survives, and she warned the committee not to mistake politeness for honesty. Kennedy nodded as if he agreed, then added that moral clarity is exactly why he insists on receipts, timelines, and outcomes, because morality without proof becomes branding. The gallery leaned forward, not because they suddenly loved procurement policy, but because they sensed a trap opening in slow motion. He asked her, in a tone that sounded almost like coaching, whether she wanted to keep this as a referendum on his biography or turn it back toward infrastructure deliverables. AOC said she'd gladly talk deliverables, but only if Kennedy admitted that his party's fiscal discipline always seems to vanish when corporations ask for it. Kennedy replied that corporate favoritism is real, and he has criticized it before, but he also wants to know whether she applies the same suspicion to her own political ecosystem. That line landed differently, because it suggested the argument wasn't about left versus right, but about whether anyone in power can resist the temptation to protect their own team. AOC's expression tightened, and you could see the calculation behind her eyes, like someone realizing the opponent isn't chasing her. He's guiding her toward a particular cliff. Kennedy said, in this dramatized hearing, that he'd reviewed how narratives get built in the age of algorithms, and he'd noticed how quickly moral certainty becomes a commodity. He asked a simple question that was not simple at all. When a politician becomes famous, who benefits first, the district or the brand? AOC answered that her visibility forces issues into the mainstream, and she argued that without pressure, the institution only moves when donors tell it to move. Kennedy responded that visibility is a tool, but tools can either build or perform, and sometimes the same tool becomes a hammer for nails and a spotlight for ego. The room laughed lightly when he said spotlight, because it wasn't cruel, but it was sharp enough to make people glance at the cameras and feel implicated. AOC tried to flip the joke back on him by saying that theatrics didn't start with her generation, and she pointed to decades of staged outrage and cable news grandstanding. Kennedy said he wouldn't defend anyone who turns governance into a reality show, and then he asked her whether she believed social media rewards the most responsible leaders. AOC said social media rewards attention, not responsibility, but she insisted that attention is a necessary weapon against entrenched power, because quiet reforms get buried. Kennedy replied that attention can be a weapon, but it can also be an addiction. And addictions don't negotiate. They consume, and they always ask for more. For the first time, AOC didn't interrupt him quickly because he wasn't accusing her of evil. He was accusing the environment of making temptation feel like destiny. Then he moved the discussion into the only territory that can't be retweeted into existence: trade-offs, timelines, and measurable consequences. He asked her, specifically, whether she would rather have an imperfect infrastructure bill that passes and fixes bridges now, or a perfect bill that dies and fixes nothing. AOC said she refuses to accept imperfect as an excuse for surrender, because surrender is how inequality gets normalized, one compromise at a time. Kennedy said he respects that instinct, but he warned that voters living with broken roads and dangerous water systems experience perfect rhetoric as abandonment. He added, with a quiet edge, that the public often forgives an honest compromise faster than it forgives a beautiful speech that leaves them exactly where they started. At that moment, you could feel the generational argument becoming a proxy for something more uncomfortable, which is the argument about who gets to define seriousness. AOC was speaking like seriousness is moral urgency, and Kennedy was speaking like seriousness is procedural responsibility, and both definitions have consequences. Kennedy asked her to name 3 infrastructure projects in her district that were currently delayed and to explain in plain language where the bottleneck lived. AOC gave an answer that emphasized underfunding and bureaucratic inertia, and she framed the delays as proof the system is designed to frustrate working people. Kennedy replied that she might be right, but he still wanted the public to hear the precise bottleneck because the system is too vague to fix and too convenient to blame. AOC then accused him of trying to corner her into technical trivia to make her look unprepared, and she said that trick is older than both of them. Kennedy answered that trivia is useless, but mechanics aren't trivia, because a bridge fails by mechanics, not by ideology, and the public deserves leaders who respect that. He made a small, almost mischievous joke that if he ever tried to dunk on her, he'd need a ladder and probably medical clearance. And the room laughed again. But then he turned serious and said that humor is cheap, and what isn't cheap is the trust of people who are one collapsed overpass away from tragedy. AOC's supporters in the gallery looked like they wanted her to fire back, but she hesitated because he had pulled the audience away from personality and into stakes. This is where my view matters, because the deeper fight here isn't whether AOC is right about inequality or whether Kennedy is right about governance, since both can be partly true. The deeper fight is whether politics becomes a competition for moral dominance or a discipline of measurable responsibility, and the public keeps getting punished for choosing only one. AOC's style wins the internet because it feels like courage, and Kennedy's style wins committee rooms because it feels like control, and the country is stuck needing both. Kennedy knows that if he can frame her as a brand-first politician, he weakens her authority without ever calling her a bad person, which is the most effective kind of attack. AOC knows that if she can frame him as a polished symbol of quiet cruelty, she makes every procedural point sound like an excuse, which is the most effective kind of defense. So when Kennedy finally said calmly that the committee would proceed with specific questions and that he hoped she'd answer with specifics rather than slogans, the room understood the subtext. AOC nodded, but her nod wasn't surrender. It was the look of someone deciding whether to fight on his terrain or drag him back onto hers. Kennedy adjusted his papers like a man who wasn't improvising, and that small gesture told the audience this was not a spontaneous clash. It was an arranged collision. AOC took a breath, glanced toward the gallery, and you could see her measuring what would play well on screens versus what would sound strong in the official record. And right there, At the hinge between performance and proof, the confrontation moved into its next phase, because now each answer would carry a cost either in optics or in substance. Kennedy began the next sequence by asking questions that sounded almost boring on the surface, because boredom is often the camouflage of precision. He asked about timelines, cost overruns, and contractor accountability, the kinds of details that never trend, but always decide whether a project lives or dies. AOC answered confidently at first, emphasizing that delays are often the result of political sabotage rather than administrative failure. Kennedy listened without interrupting, which made her voice fill the room, and that fullness subtly shifted responsibility onto every word she chose. When he finally spoke, he didn't contradict her directly. He narrowed the frame, which is far more dangerous than open disagreement. He said that sabotage exists, but sabotage is not a plan, and accusing enemies does not move concrete, steel, or timelines forward. AOC replied that naming power is the first step to confronting it, and she warned that refusing to name it is how injustice gets normalized. Kennedy agreed again, and agreement from an opponent can feel unsettling because it removes the comfort of a clear villain. He then asked whether naming power without constraining it risks turning outrage into a substitute for results. The room felt the tension rise because that question didn't attack her values. It questioned her effectiveness. At this point, AOC shifted her tone, becoming more measured, because she sensed the audience moving from applause to evaluation. She spoke about coalition building, about forcing conversations that never would have happened without pressure. Kennedy acknowledged that pressure can crack doors open, but he warned that doors still need hinges, or they collapse instead of opening. He added a dry line that made even a few skeptics smile, saying that revolutions are exciting until someone has to file the maintenance report. The humor worked because it wasn't cruel. It was weary, the humor of someone who has watched grand ideas stumble over small details. AOC countered by saying that weariness can become an excuse, and that fatigue is often the language of people who benefit from delay. Kennedy responded that fatigue can also be the language of people who have watched preventable failures repeat because nobody wanted to slow down. The exchange started to feel less like a duel and more like a mirror, with each accusing the other of the same sin from different angles. That mirroring unsettled the audience because it suggested the problem wasn't character, but incentives. And incentives, unlike personalities, don't leave the room when the hearing ends. Kennedy then asked her whether she believes public trust is strengthened by constant confrontation or by visible follow-through. AOC said trust comes from people feeling seen and heard, especially when they've been ignored for decades. Kennedy said being seen without being served eventually feels like betrayal, even if the intentions were good. That line landed quietly, without drama, which is often how the most damaging points arrive. AOC didn't snap back immediately because the implication wasn't ideological, it was personal. Here's where I want to pause and be clear with viewers, because this is the moment the internet usually misses. This wasn't Kennedy destroying AOC, and it wasn't AOC exposing Kennedy. It was two political philosophies colliding under a microscope. One believes legitimacy flows from moral urgency and public alignment. The other believes legitimacy flows from consistency and execution. Both philosophies claim to serve working people, and both can fail those same people in different ways. And the tragedy of modern politics is that audiences are trained to cheer one failure over the other instead of demanding something better than both. AOC tried to reassert control by reminding the room that progress has never come from patience alone. Kennedy replied that progress that ignores limits often creates backlash that erases gains entirely. She said backlash is inevitable whenever power is challenged, and waiting for comfort is how injustice survives. He said backlash is not fate. It's often a response to leaders who confuse momentum with mandate. The difference between those two interpretations hung in the air, unresolved and heavy. As this phase closed, Kennedy leaned back slightly and said something that sounded almost reflective rather than adversarial. He said the hardest thing in politics is accepting that good intentions do not reduce the damage of bad execution. AOC replied that the hardest thing is accepting that execution without vision preserves a broken status quo. Neither answer satisfied the other, and neither fully satisfied the audience either. And that discomfort, more than any insult or applause line, marked the moment when the hearing stopped being theater and started becoming a genuine test of leadership. The fourth phase opened with a noticeable change in temperature, because by now, the room had learned that neither outrage nor charm was going to end this cleanly. Kennedy shifted from questioning her arguments to questioning the cost of those arguments, not in dollars alone, but in credibility, which is the most fragile currency in public life. He said that every time a leader frames compromise as betrayal, they train their supporters to see governance as failure by definition. AOC pushed back by saying compromise has been weaponized as a way to launder injustice, because endless half measures often mean the same people keep losing. The audience could feel both truths pressing against each other, because most Americans have lived inside compromises that felt less like progress and more like postponement. Kennedy then asked something that sounded almost philosophical, but landed like a professional diagnosis. He asked whether politics should primarily make people feel morally validated or materially safer when the two don't align on the same timeline. AOC answered that moral validation isn't a luxury, it's a prerequisite, because people won't trust systems that treat their pain as an inconvenience. Kennedy replied that material safety delayed too long becomes another form of cruelty, especially for people who don't have the buffer to wait for perfect outcomes. That exchange crystallized the conflict into a single uncomfortable truth. Urgency and durability often demand opposite behaviors from leaders. At this point, AOC changed tactics and leaned into storytelling, describing families she'd met who live with moldy walls, collapsing stairs, and schools held together by promises. Her voice softened, and the room responded, because stories humanize policy in ways charts never will. Kennedy didn't challenge the stories, and that restraint mattered, because attacking lived experience is how politicians lose moral ground instantly. Instead, he said stories deserve follow-through, and follow-through requires systems that don't break under the weight of emotion. He warned that when leaders substitute storytelling for structure, they risk turning people's suffering into a renewable resource for attention. AOC bristled at that, saying she rejects the idea that giving voice to pain is exploitation. Kennedy clarified that giving voice isn't the problem, repeating it without delivery is, because unmet promises compound disappointment into cynicism. That line drew a few nervous laughs, because cynicism is the disease everyone recognizes but no one claims to spread. AOC accused him of sounding like someone who has made peace with slow injustice. Kennedy replied that he has made peace only with the idea that broken systems don't heal faster because we shout at them louder. The generational tension became explicit when AOC said that her generation no longer believes patience is virtuous because patience has been used as a leash. Kennedy answered that impatience can become a blindfold, and blindfolded leadership often walks people straight into walls. He joked dryly that the laws of physics don't care how righteous you feel when you drive too fast. The humor landed because it didn't dismiss her values, it questioned her method. And methods, unlike values, are where political reputations are actually made or broken. Here's where the audience reaction shifted in a way you could almost hear. Early applause had been tribal, loud, and predictable. But now the room was quieter, because people were listening instead of performing agreement. AOC noticed that shift and tried to reconnect emotionally, reminding the audience that she represents people who were never invited into these rooms before. Kennedy acknowledged that representation matters, but he added that representation without results eventually feels symbolic rather than substantive. That distinction cut deeper than any insult, because nobody wants to believe their hope has been reduced to a symbol. Kennedy then posed what I'd call the most dangerous question of the hearing so far. He asked whether AOC believes the system is capable of reform at all, or whether her rhetoric implies it must be burned down to be replaced. AOC said reform has historically come only when disruption forces it, and she rejected the idea that stability is inherently virtuous. Kennedy said instability always charges interest, and the people with the least savings pay the highest rate. The metaphor stuck because it reframed disruption not as bravery or recklessness, but as a loan someone else has to repay. AOC responded sharply that stability for some has meant suffocation for others, and she accused Kennedy of defending a comfort he never had to question. Kennedy didn't deny his comfort, and instead said something that surprised the room by its humility. He said, "Comfort can blind people, but rage can blind them too. And leadership requires seeing clearly, even when the crowd wants you blind." That line didn't trend, but it landed, because it sounded less like a rebuttal and more like a warning to both of them. And warnings feel different when they come without applause attached. By the end of this phase, it was clear that neither side was winning cleanly, because the debate had exposed something larger than either personality. AOC had shown how moral urgency can pierce complacency and force attention where it's long been denied. Kennedy had shown how unchecked urgency can erode trust and leave people with speeches instead of scaffolding. The audience wasn't choosing sides as easily now, because the conflict no longer fit a hero-villain script. And as the hearing moved forward, the question stopped being who was right and started being whether the system rewards the kind of leadership that can hold both urgency and restraint without collapsing under its own contradictions. The fifth movement of the confrontation felt heavier, not louder, because by this point, neither side was playing for applause anymore. Kennedy leaned into consequence, the kind that shows up months later in budget overruns, stalled projects, and voters who stop believing anyone knows what they're doing. He said that when leaders frame every setback as sabotage, they quietly teach the public that failure is always someone else's fault. AOC responded that accountability has historically flowed downward, never upward, and that naming obstruction is the first step toward breaking that pattern. The exchange wasn't hostile, but it was tense, because both of them were now arguing about responsibility rather than ideology. Kennedy asked whether responsibility includes admitting when pressure tactics backfire. AOC said pressure always looks messy from the inside, but that mess is the price of shaking systems that benefit from order. Kennedy replied that shaking systems without stabilizing them afterward leaves ordinary people holding the debris. He added, with a half-smile, that revolutions make great posters, but they don't usually come with an instruction manual. A few people laughed, but the laugh carried unease, because nobody in the room could deny the truth buried inside the joke. AOC tried to reclaim the moral high ground by emphasizing that she doesn't measure success only in bills passed, but in narratives changed. She argued that before policy can move, culture has to move, and culture moves when someone is willing to disrupt polite silence. Kennedy answered that culture without structure is like a rally without exits, energizing until people realize they're stuck. He said narratives matter, but they become dangerous when they promise outcomes they cannot deliver. That line hit harder than expected because broken promises linger longer than failed votes. At this stage, the audience began reacting differently, not with cheers, but with nods and murmurs, because the debate sounded uncomfortably familiar. Most people have worked for someone who talked beautifully about values and someone else who delivered results without inspiration, and both left scars. AOC represented the voice that makes people feel seen, especially those who were invisible for generations. Kennedy represented the voice that insists being seen means little if the system still doesn't function. The room could feel that choosing between those voices meant choosing which kind of disappointment felt more tolerable. Kennedy then raised the issue of credibility, not as an accusation, but as a slow leak that can sink even the best-intentioned leaders. He said credibility erodes when leaders promise inevitability instead of difficulty, because reality always collects on optimism eventually. AOC countered that credibility also erodes when leaders hide behind complexity to avoid moral clarity. Kennedy agreed, but he drew a line between explaining complexity and exploiting it, a line many politicians cross without noticing. That distinction mattered because it reframed the problem as discipline rather than ideology. There was a brief moment of unexpected humor when Kennedy said that if slogans fixed infrastructure, the country would be paved in hashtags by now. AOC smirked despite herself, because the joke wasn't aimed at her alone, but at the entire ecosystem that rewards noise over nuance. She shot back that if nuance paid the rent, half her district wouldn't be choosing between groceries and utilities. Kennedy replied that neither hashtags nor nuance pay rent, wages do, and wages depend on systems that actually run. The humor faded quickly, replaced by the weight of shared recognition. AOC then tried something riskier, admitting that not every fight she's chosen has produced immediate wins. She said loss doesn't invalidate the fight, because some battles exist to shift the ground, not to plant a flag. Kennedy respected the admission, but he warned that voters don't live on eventual ground shifts. They live in the present. He said leaders must decide when symbolism fuels momentum and when it drains it. That warning felt less like a critique and more like advice offered too late to take back. From my perspective, this was the moment the hearing stopped being about who was smarter or sharper. It became about whether modern politics allows leaders to evolve publicly without being destroyed for admitting limits. AOC was clearly grappling with the tension between being a symbol and being a steward. Kennedy was pressing the idea that stewardship requires disappointing people today to protect them tomorrow. Neither role is glamorous, and that's exactly why the system struggles to reward them honestly. As the fifth phase drew toward its end, Kennedy said something that cut through the noise without raising his voice. He said the most dangerous lie in politics is that intention erases outcome. AOC responded quietly that the most dangerous lie is that outcome can be separated from intention. Neither backed down, but neither escalated either, because escalation would have cheapened the moment. And as the room settled into an uneasy silence, it was clear that the next phase wouldn't be about winning the argument, but about what kind of leadership the country is actually willing to tolerate. The final phase arrived without drama, which was itself a statement, because by then both Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and John Kennedy understood that volume would only cheapen what had already been exposed. Kennedy spoke first, not to score points, but to frame the moment, saying that the hardest conversations in democracy barely end with a winner, only with consequences. AOC listened without interrupting, and that silence mattered, because earlier silence had been tactical, while this silence felt reflective. The audience sensed it too, because the room no longer felt like a battlefield, but like a jury deliberation happening in public. And that shift changed what every word meant from that point forward. Kennedy said that he does not doubt AOC's sincerity, and that statement landed heavier than an insult would have, because sincerity is not the same as sufficiency. He argued that public office demands more than passion and more than presence. It demands the discipline to accept that good intentions do not cancel bad outcomes. AOC responded that discipline without empathy becomes administration without soul. And she warned that people disengage when politics sounds like a lecture instead of a lifeline. Kennedy agreed again, and the agreement no longer felt strategic. It felt weary, as if both had reached the same wall from opposite directions. What remained unresolved was not who cared more, but who could translate care into results without hollowing it out. At this point, someone in the gallery asked aloud why Kennedy had been so persistent, and why AOC had been so confrontational from the start. Kennedy answered that confrontation is often how truth gets invited into the room, but persistence is how it stays there after the applause fades. AOC added that confrontation is sometimes the only language institutions hear, especially when patience has been demanded from the same communities for generations. Both answers were incomplete on their own, and together they formed an uncomfortable truth about power responding only when pressured and breaking when pressured too hard. The audience didn't cheer because the answer didn't flatter anyone watching. Kennedy then said something that felt less like a closing argument and more like a warning for the future. He said that politics is becoming addicted to certainty because certainty travels faster than humility, even when humility is more honest. AOC replied that uncertainty has been weaponized against people who already live with instability, and that clarity can feel like survival. Kennedy said clarity that isn't earned collapses under scrutiny, and when it collapses, it takes public trust with it. That exchange captured the entire tension of the hearing in 4 sentences, and nothing more needed to be said to explain it. Here is where I'll give my view plainly, because pretending not to have one would be dishonest. AOC represents a generation that is done waiting for institutions to redeem themselves, and that impatience is justified by history. Kennedy represents a generation that has seen movements burn bright and then burn out, leaving the most vulnerable standing in the ashes. Both perspectives are rooted in real experience, and both become dangerous when treated as complete on their own. The failure is not theirs alone, but a system that rewards clarity over accuracy and performance over preparation. As the hearing drew to a close, Kennedy said that leadership is not about being right in public, but about being responsible in private when nobody is watching. AOC said leadership is also about refusing to let private responsibility become an excuse for public silence. Neither contradicted the other directly, because contradiction would have simplified something that had become deeply complex. The chair called time, and for the first time that day, the end did not feel like a victory lap for anyone. It felt like an unresolved chord, hanging in the air long after the microphones went quiet. People watching at home wanted a verdict, because verdicts are comforting and ambiguity is not. But what they got instead was a mirror, reflecting a political culture that forces leaders to choose between urgency and endurance. AOC left having reminded the country that pain ignored does not disappear. It hardens into anger. Kennedy left having reminded the country that anger unmanaged does not build. It destabilizes. Neither reminder cancels the other, and that is exactly the problem democracy keeps postponing. If you're still asking why the criticism at the beginning felt so sharp, the answer should be clear now. The attack wasn't just about policy or personality. It was about who gets to claim moral authority in an era that confuses visibility with virtue. This hearing mattered not because someone was embarrassed or outmaneuvered, but because it exposed how thin the line has become between advocacy and accountability. The audience didn't leave with certainty, and that may be the most honest outcome politics can still offer. Because the real question isn't whether Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or John Kennedy won the exchange, but whether the system that stages exchanges like this is still capable of producing leaders who can carry urgency and responsibility at the same time without collapsing under the weight of both.